Hello and welcome to today's Middle East Report. In this programme today we'll be discussing Zionism, that is the political ideology that underpins the State of Israel, is under attack. Shalom and a warm welcome to the programme. And my guest for today's programme is Sharon Clough from Campaign for Truth and Ambrosine Shitlerit from Eye on Anti-Semitism. So ladies, welcome to the programme.
Thank you.
I'll start off with you, Sharon. It's great to have you back on the Middle East Report, and I know that you work very closely with Ambrosine in campaigning for truth regarding Israel. Can you just share with us some of the activities that you've been involved in recently regarding campaigning for Israel?
Okay, thank you, Simon, for inviting us back again, and it's nice to be here together with Ambrosine and to share our thoughts with you. The campaigns that we work on are to try and expose the truth about issues, and one of the things that we found lacking was a focus on what was happening vis-a-vis Hamas in Israel. And now in the broader Middle East. And so our very first campaign was to expose Hamas and how the BBC represented Hamas. I guess one of our big achievements was to get the Hamas Charter linked into the BBC webpage on the history of Hamas. We moved on to many other campaigns. One of them was the BBC. When the Charter was up for renewal, we arranged a meeting in the House of Commons, hosted by our MP, where we had our seller from BBC Watch come and speak with Lady Deitch. And we then had a big community meeting where we attracted over nearly 600 people to discuss the BBC, how it functions vis-a-vis Israel, and to try and have some input into the new charter that was coming out. We were the sole organization that actually stood against the Iran deal, and we did two events. I don't know if you remember, we went to Downing Street and we presented a petition to David Cameron then. And we also went to the newly opened Iran embassy, and that was really quite funny because somebody called the police and there were nine motorcycles arrived to remove these two women and a few supporters.
Dangerous women. I'm sure the viewers will understand the threat that you pose later on in the programme, certainly to our enemies, which is good. And Ambrosine, it's good to have you back on the programme, because we did a programme where we're discussing the rise of Jew hatred online, particularly on social media such as Facebook and Twitter and what have you. So since you're last on, any particular focus you've been focusing and campaigning on regarding social media and anti-Semitic content?
Well, we've done quite a few campaigns since we've last been on the TV. One has been regarding breaking the silence, if your viewers know about breaking the silence or not. This is an organisation, it's a small left-wing NGO that basically delegitimizes Israel through its actions and testimonies of a few individual soldiers who are exposed as to be prominently treating Palestinian people or Palestinian children badly. A lot of these testimonies have been debunked. There's been documentaries on Israeli TV about it, and unfortunately they were up for an award at the Index Awards. The Index Award are particularly about freedom of speech, and they were up for an award a couple of months ago at this ceremony. So we all went down to the Unicorn Theatre in London, and we made a protest outside, and the protest was, and we were giving out information that breaking the silence should not be up for an award regarding against censorship, because they are actually causing propaganda, delegitimizing Israel. And in fact, in the middle of that, we heard that they had lost, or they weren't actually going to win an award. So that was one successful campaign. And the other one was recently where we got together with Campaign for Truth, and we went down to support the students at SOAS It was a huge event, a pro-Palestinian and pro-BDS event against the ambassador Mark Regev speaking at this particular university, and a lot of the organizations within the Jewish community got together, and we helped support the Jewish students of SOAS. Unfortunately, there was a lot of antagonism, and it was very hostile. We did a live feed of that, and the publicity that got went across every media outlet. So we've been doing a lot of work since we've last come on.
Good. Glad to see that you're both very active and busy on behalf of Israel. Sharon, in today's programme we're discussing Zionism, and Zionism is essentially the main political ideology that underpins the modern state of Israel. Can you share with us what Zionism is and its definition, and why the term Zionism has been attacked so much, and particularly in recent years?
Okay. Zion, as you know, is actually intrinsic to what it is to be Jewish. You know that Mount Zion is where David's city is. And we have in our prayers every day, I can't tell you how many times we mention the word Zion. So Zion is not a modern, Zionism is not really a modern word. It's really the right of the Jews to the aspirations of their homeland. That's really what Zionism is. What has happened with it is it's been hijacked by the anti-Israel lobby to try and find a way to get around being anti-Semites. So they use the word Zionism as a way of attacking Israel, but in a sense that's attacking the body of the Jewish people, because for me and for us, Israel is very much the embodiment of the Jewish nation. So it's become a political entity. It's been embraced by organizations like the PSC, which is probably the major disseminator of this propaganda, certainly here in the UK. They are in fact very closely associated with the BDS that Ambrosine mentioned. And they're there to delegitimize Israel, and they use this to protect themselves from accusations of race hate against Jews.
And Ambrosine, when does anti-Zionism become anti-Semitism?
The term anti-Zionism, we believe that anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism, and the reason for that is that the concentration of just one individual state, the state of Israel, Zionists, particularly Jewish Zionists, Christian Zionists, that becomes a ploy for them to use, that they don't concentrate on any other country in the world that has issues such as Syria and most of the Middle East. So when you use that particular terminology, when you're an anti-Zionist, when you're anti-Israel, we believe that is anti-Semitism. You're concentrating on one particular area of the world. You're concentrating on just one Jewish state, one Jewish country. And when you start to target incessantly Israel, we would say that you would be anti-Semitic, and obviously we're going to talk about the definition of anti-Semitism, and that brings it in.
Excellent. So let's have a look at the modern history of modern Zionism, and how Zionism as a political ideology helped to re-establish the modern state of Israel back on the 14th of May 1948.
May 14th, 1948, 4 p.m. Tel Aviv. On a small podium stands a determined Zionist leader before a hastily convened gathering, reading out a proclamation which would change the course of history. This is how the State of Israel was born. First, a bit of background. At the end of World War I, the Allied powers gained control over the Middle East, including the land of Israel. The League of Nations recognized the historical connection of the Jewish people to their land and granted Great Britain a mandate to help them reconstitute a national home. However, Arab riots and geopolitical considerations led to a series of British restrictions on Jewish development and immigration. Even ships, including displaced children and the Holocaust survivors, were sent back to Europe. Jewish resistance grew as well. By 1947, the ball was back in the United Nations Court, where a majority of the nations decided on November 29th, after a tense vote, to divide the land into a Jewish and an Arab state. The Jews rejoiced. The local Arab population, well, they launched a war throughout the country. May 15th, 1948 was the date the British mandate officially ended, the date the Jewish state was to be declared. and the date 5 regular Arab armies planned a coordinated attack to annihilate the newborn state. On May 12th, David Ben-Gurion convened the People's Council. The atmosphere was grave. Moshe Sharet reported that the Americans are demanding a postponement of the declaration, or else they would not help Israel against the united Arab invasion. Golda Meir reported that King Abdullah had retracted his original agreement and will join the attack. Military leaders expressed serious doubts about the ability of the small Jewish community to withstand 5 regular Arab armies equipped with European weaponry. But somehow, after 13 hours of deliberations, Ben-Gurion succeeds in swaying the balance against the American demand. And on Friday, May 14th, in the presence of local Jewish leaders, he declares the establishment of the State of Israel. The proclamation, which was inspired by the American Declaration of Independence, asserted the historical and moral rights of the Jewish people in its historic homeland
and defined Israel as a Jewish democratic state.
based on equal rights, freedom, and justice. The declaration ended with a call on Jews to return home and extended a hand for peace towards the local Arab population and neighboring Arab countries. The Arab invasion was immediate and lasted for over a year. Close to 50% of Israel's small fighting force were survivors of the Nazi death camps who vowed never again. 1 out of every 100 Jews living in Israel died in the fighting. But by the end of the war, the small Jewish state had emerged victorious as an independent nation in its homeland for the first time in 2,000 years.
There you go. That was a presentation on the history of modern Zionism with the re-establishment of the State of Israel on the 14th of May 1948. Sharon, in terms of what Zionism essentially means that the Jewish people have the right to return and live in their ancient covenant homeland, which today is Israel, in the Middle East. Isn't it? It's just that simple, isn't it?
It's actually quite simple, yes, that's it. You know that every year for almost 2,000 years we have prayed that next year in Jerusalem. And this is why this year is really important for Jewish people, because we are in Jerusalem and it's the anniversary of the regaining of Jerusalem in 1967. The problem about it is the rise of, I think we spoke before about the rise of anti-Semitism in recent years. And that's very closely linked to the propaganda that came out of the Second World War and the way that that was dealt with in the Middle East, and the collaboration between the Arabs of the Middle East under the Grand Mufti with the Nazis. And the Nazis developed a huge propaganda that really brought back to the Muslims a fervor for their Islamism. And it's very we're doing a program on that tonight, and it's very interesting to see how much input they had on that. And that's been carried forward now, and the modern anti-Semitism is very much an Islamic-backed anti-Semitism that we're seeing manifesting. And that's why it's focusing very much on attacking Israel, on trying to eradicate Israel, because if you eradicate Israel, you put the Jews back into the situation they were in 1935, 1936. And make us vulnerable again, in a sense, make us orphans without a homeland.
Yeah, because, Sharon, I mean, if we look back at the way that Zionism has been attacked, there was that famous speech by Yasser Arafat in the UN General Assembly, I think it was 1976, in which he endorsed and advocated that Zionism was racism that was then adopted by the UN Security Council. How did they come to the conclusion that Zionism is racism, and how has this lie been able to maintain its prominence over the decades?
I think that what they focus very much on is the idea that Israel was recreated because the Jews came from Europe, from the Holocaust, and were foreign invaders, in a sense, of a land that was owned by a people called the Palestinian people. And this is patently untrue. There have been a continuous stream of Jews and a Jewish presence in the Holy Land ever since Judaism was first created. And of course, it negates the idea of the Jews from the Arab lands, who were also suffered from being moved out of their homes in the various Arab lands. So This idea of it's almost in a sense a blood libel, that is saying that the Ashkenazi Jews from Europe took away the lands, and so you get ideas of Jewish colonialism. You get an idea that Zionism is a political entity that's trying to destroy these Palestinian people. We mustn't forget that in the mandated time of Palestine, the Palestinians were the Jews. If you look at the paper that came out of the Foreign Office, it talks about the Jews as the Palestinians, and it talks about Arabs. It doesn't talk about Arab Palestinians even. It talks about Arabs and Jews, and the Jews were really much the Palestinians. And that changed in 1964 when the PLO was started, when they created a nation called the Palestinians. They didn't exist before then. They were Arabs who had come into the area because the Jews were creating jobs for them.
And Ambersine, last autumn, Theresa May, our Prime Minister, adopted the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance definition of anti-Semitism. What does that mean, and how does this help to fight against the rise of anti-Semitism?
Well, just to let you know that since the definition of anti-Semitism, I've been monitoring social media and other small anti-Israel NGOs, and they're not happy with what Theresa May has done, and this has put them in a predicament, because it's saying to them face on that your terminology that you're using, Zio, and all the other degrading blood libel type of language, is not something that is extended separate from anti-Semitism. It is part of anti-Semitism. So anti-Semitism basically now entwines that we are Jews, we are Zionists, and if you degrade us by using the term Zionism in a language that basically humiliates us, humiliates the Jewish people, brings the Jewish people down both physically and through the land of Israel. This all encompasses everything. But as you see, they're not very happy about it. So we're getting lots of messages and screenshots of these organizations who are anti the definition of anti-Semitism. They haven't actually looked at themselves to know that they are racist, they are anti-Semitic. So we're monitoring that quite carefully, and I think Theresa May has done a specific job and a reason, because the anti-Semitism was so high, and people were saying, well, we're not anti-Semitic, we're not anti-Jewish, we're not saying anything about the Jews, we're just talking about Zionists. And so they're basically cloaking the name of Zionism or Zionists to really mean Jews, and that's, you know.
And in terms of, obviously, the opponents of Israel who maybe like to cloak their anti-Semitism within anti-Zionism terminology, has there been any repercussions yet so far in terms of actually arrests or those people being under investigation for breaching the new definition of anti-Semitism?
Well, we have two particular cases that are going through the police and the CPS, which I can't talk about still. One is basically somebody who is far right and initially was far left and then morphed into becoming a nationalist and became harassing with anti-Semitic rhetoric, mainly anti-Zionist rhetoric. This is so important to understand, that they're using the enemies of Israel, the anti-Semites, Sharon calls it the Red-Green Alliance. These terms are being used to degrade the Jewish people. And so we're finding that the police and the CPS are having to relook at cases that we have brought up to the police to say, well, look, now there is a definition. Now you need to go back and see what we've shown you. The harassment, the bullying, the attacks, the threats. And you're going to have to relook at these cases and see that this was racism. This is utter racism and anti-Semitism.
Yeah, it's good that the government are cracking down on this, because I think it's very important, not only for the safety and future of the Jewish community in this country, but also for our own national security and also for the defence of our society.
Absolutely.
As we know historically. And Sharon, how much can we blame the international community for this rise of Jew hatred, for the demonization of Israel, primarily because they seem to look at this conflict between the Israelis and the Palestinians in a very simple way, and and single out the Jewish settlers to blame for all the ills and all the troubles that are occurring in the Middle East, and turning a blind eye essentially to Palestinian incitement to hatred and the glorification of violence and terrorism directed against the Jewish state and the Jewish people.
Okay, so two things. In 1967, there were no settlers in the area called the West Bank that we call Judea and Samaria. It was completely Jew-free. It was controlled and occupied by Jordan. There were no Jews there, but yet there were wars trying to fight Israel. That's the first thing. What has the international community got to do with it? We find that the United Nations is increasingly peopled by a lot of the Islamic states. And the problem there is that there's resolution after resolution against Israel alone in the whole world. And that filters through. It filters through into people's consciousness that there must be something wrong with the country if it's always being brought before the international court, so to speak. So that's another issue there, that sitting on the Security Council, for instance, is Syria, and we all know what's happening in Syria. So I think that the international community have a lot to answer for. The third thing I might say is that when there are terrorist attacks in the West, across Europe, in America, and they mention previous terrorist attacks, they never bring into it what's happened in Israel. It's almost as though the issues in Israel stand apart from what's happening to the rest of the world. And until they understand that this is one and the same issue that faces world security, I think we're going to carry on facing this attack on Israel, and we're going to carry on facing what happened in Manchester last night. Unless those dots are joined up, to see that this problem is now, the current problem is an Islamic terrorist problem on Western civilization. And I think you'll find that Huntington wrote about that. The interesting thing is Huntington is being quoted today vis-a-vis what happened last night, and vis-a-vis President Trump's visit to the Middle East. People are beginning to go back and revisit Huntington and what he said about this clash of civilization.
And Amber Singh, you know, when we look at the problem to do with Israel, essentially, Israel's being singled out. Now, you're married to an Israeli, you have family out in Israel. How does Israel respond as a nation, and how do the Israeli people respond to the fact of this growing hatred against their nation, against their state? They have to contend with this in the Middle East, and they probably understand that. But when it comes from Western capitals and Western nations, what's their response?
Well, Israel doesn't have to deal with the anti-Semitism that we have to deal with in Europe and across the diaspora. Gotcha. So in a lot of ways, Israelis are just waking up to the fact of what's happening. They've had to deal with the global terrorism, they've had to deal with Hamas and Hezbollah, but they're not dealing with the incessant Jew hatred that we are. So we in the diaspora are very important. We're important for a few main reasons. One, that we're standing alone in fighting this hatred of Jews, that Zionism is being used as a terminology, because I never, when I was in my 20s as a student, I never used the term Zionism or Zionist. I never even heard about it until I went onto social media and was monitoring the hatred of Israel and the Jewish people. And I think that Israel have woken up also in the last few years. We've had a decade of BDS. We've had a decade of anti-Zionist hatred, predominantly, I think, from 9/11. And so the Israelis are sort of understanding that they not just have a problem with terrorism, but now they have a problem outside of Israel. And I know that the government of Israel are doing a lot of work to try and help organizations such as ours and others to fight this particular defamation and delegitimization of Israel.
And Sharon, your organisation, Campaign for Truth, very much organised counter-rallies against the BDS, known as the Boycott, Divestments and Sanctions, as well as the Palestinian Solidarity Campaign, PSC for short. And are you alarmed at many of their rallies in which they chant that Palestine will be free from the river to the sea? Essentially, what does that statement mean, and what is its implications for Israel and the Jewish people?
Okay, I think that statement is probably the most important statement that they have come up with. Palestine will be free from the river to the sea. By Palestine, they mean an Arab Palestine, not a Jewish Palestine. We know from President Abbas that when he has a Palestine, it will be Jew-free. He has said that. So this freedom of Palestine to the sea is taking it away from the green line that used to be the discussion, the green line being the ceasefire line after the 48 war. And they're taking it to what we call the blue line being the Mediterranean Sea. So if we try and examine what that is saying, is that Palestine is going to be free right up to the Mediterranean. It's going to be Jew-free because that's what their leaders are saying. So in a sense, what they're saying is let's exterminate the Jews. This is a new genocide. It's a genocide on the Jews of Israel, and therefore it's a genocide on the Jews of the world. So we're going back again to 1935, where Jews are under threat. Never again is happening again.
Let's have a look now at a campaign advert on behalf of the Palestinian Solidarity Campaign featuring, so let me look at my notes, Liam Brime, NP, and this is the PSC's lobby of Parliament.
So I'm here today to support the lobby of Parliament organised by the Palestine Solidarity Campaign, and the issue that they have been promoting today is this issue around illegal settlements by Israeli settlers in Palestine. It's fragmenting Palestine, it's fragmenting the West Bank in particular, and it's making the process of peace not easier, but much, much harder. In particular, it's really going to damage the ability for Palestine to put together a strong state for the future. So what we've been hearing about today from the organisers like Hugh and others is what they want parliamentarians to do. And they want MPs like me to put this back on the agenda here in Parliament, where quite frankly, because of events in the Middle East, the issue of Palestine has slipped off the radar a bit. So it's a very, very successful lobby. I'm hoping that you can link to their website from the information we're publishing around this post today and give them your support like I have today. Do you think Palestine has fallen off Parliament's radar a bit?
It has. I think partly there's been the election and there hasn't been the focal point. There's been Syria and other areas, but on the ground actually things are getting physically worse day by day for the Palestinians as the settlements are colonising them, putting them into little areas surrounded by walls and with no access and no freedom. So the situation, although it's not being talked about, is daily making peace less and less possible. Worse, I don't know if you've been to Hebron, which is in the south of the West Bank and so on, where the main street, like our Oxford Street, has been taken over, and there's a settlement at one end and half the mosque at the other end has been taken over. And it is just like a no-go area in the middle of your city, and over the market there's meshing to stop rocks and excrement and stuff being thrown onto the Palestinian people while they're at market. So you are seeing that sort of, and just getting around. I mean, if you're a tourist you can get about, but actually the traditional route from Bethlehem to Jerusalem is now through checkpoints. You know, Nablus is now cut off.
That old road taken by Jesus and Mary and Joseph is about to be cut.
Yeah. And I mean, we went up to Nazareth and came back through the Jordan Valley and so on. But if Jesus was trying to do it on a donkey now, he'd just go through checkpoints. It'd be a long, hard journey. We're trying to get Parliament to say that it's the time for the world to act, that a phrase that we've been using is not good enough now just to say that the settlements are illegal. We've got to treat them as if they are illegal, and that means where's the money coming from? Are we giving support, even if we don't think we are, to this illegal activity? And that's what we'd like the British government to start reviewing its activity, having an audit almost, of how is it that this is possible, this infrastructure, this huge development going on, which the world says is illegal. The UN, the US government, the UK government, everyone says the settlement activity is wrong, and then
does nothing about it.
So that's what we're hoping today. We get the debate into the territory of what can be done about it.
That was the PSC's lobby of Parliament, and I'm sure that they won't be talking there at all about the incitement to genocide that many Palestinians living under the Palestinian Authority under the leadership of Mahmoud Abbas are being fed on a daily basis that is inciting the violence and the hatred against Israel and the Jewish people. I know that you're itching to respond to that video that we showed there, so I'm going to give you that chance now.
Okay, so I spoke earlier about no settlers being there, so-called settlers being there. My question to anybody dealing with the area is, why can't Jews live in a future Palestinian state? And none of them can answer that. But when we go to what we heard Hugh Lanning and MP Byrne talking about, there's a bit of transference here. There's a kind of replacement ideology that is used to talk about issues without reference to source material. So we have here, we heard, I think it was Hugh Lanning saying that the Israelis are throwing stones at the Arabs. Well, it's exactly the opposite. The Jews are forever being stoned, and then the story is, well, they're just stones, they're not weapons, and Israel comes along with its weapons to try and stop the stone throwing, and we know that stones kill. So there's transference going here. The actual truth of the matter is that the aggression is coming from the Arab populations, incited by people like the PSC, Hugh Lanning's PSC, which, and this is a really important issue here. Settlements are being created in the so-called West Bank by a company called the Portland Trust. We've all heard of Rawabi. Rawabi is an Arab settlement. It is, they say that they want to build up the Arab populations and give them a prosperity, but it's an Arab settlement. They are towns in which Jews cannot live. These are places that they're going to bring in 40,000 Arabs into the area, and there are 4 of them dotted across the West Bank. So what we have here, if Hugh Lanning is talking about fragmentation, the fragmentation is being created by taking barren land and making towns that didn't exist before and creating them so that they can move Arabs into the area and increase the Arab population there. So this needs to be looked at with a great deal of suspicion. What is going on in our parliament is actually the support of these people, of the terrorist organizations of Hamas and Hezbollah. This is what lies underneath it, underneath the lobbying that is done in Parliament, in the UK Parliament.
And Ambrosine, shouldn't more pressure be done and placed on behalf of the British government and our police to actually deal with this issue of incitement to genocide that we often see on so many of the pro-Palestinian rallies that are being organised? I mean, the Shalom Festival that I attended last August in Edinburgh as part of the Edinburgh Fringe was horrific. And this constant chance of Palestine will be free from the river to the sea, and shame on you, occupiers, and what have you, and the level of intimidation that they want to try and put on those attending a celebration of Israeli culture and Israeli arts.
We need to get to the bottom of who is inciting the hatred within Europe, specifically within the UK. And we know that the PSC is fundamental in the incitement against Israel, against inverted commas Zionists, inverted Jewish people. We know that the patron, one of the main patrons of the PSC is Jeremy Corbyn, Labour MP. We have an election on June the 8th. I think really people need, first of all, to understand the connection between these prominent figures within Parliament and with the PSC bombarding unknown people, people who don't really have any education or knowledge about the Middle East, talking in terms of throwing excrement without any evidence, and this is an incitement. It's not just an incitement to Jews, it's an incitement, it's a lie, it's a mistruth. And what's happening, this is building up within the support within on campuses. Now, with regards to the police, we have another Al-Quds march coming up in a few weeks' time, which I know the Jewish community have got together, most of the Jewish community, to counteract this particular march. It happens every year. And you cannot stand there while people are throwing the Nazi salute, which I've been at demonstrations, I know Sharon has, where they're throwing the Nazi salute and the police are just standing there letting it happen. And I was told that actually throwing the Nazi salute is not an illegal offence. It's not actually hatred, and there's nothing you can do about it. This was a few years ago. Things have got to change. We're not accepting that Hezbollah flags are being flown on the streets now. We've lobbied Sadiq Khan. Sadiq Khan, mayor, has basically come out with a statement to say that he's going to do something about it. You cannot have them standing on a platform talking about the annihilation of the Jewish people. And a lot of people don't understand, as I said, Middle Eastern issues. They don't understand the history of the Middle East, and when they start throwing around in Arabic, kill the Jews, when they start talking about from the river to the sea, this has got to be talked about. It's got to be, the police have got to do something about it. And the more that you try to tell them, I really fear that in the next, this is an important year, but in the next 6 months, with all the demonstrations, with all the events, and particularly with this Al-Quds march that's taking place, I think there's going to be a huge problem. We have to deal with it now.
And Sharon as well. I mean, very much the BDS are tied into this. What's the very close? Is there a close connection between the BDS and the PSC, and how do they both work together? And to the extent, how do they perpetuate the conflict rather than being work towards a peaceful coexistence between the Israelis and the Palestinians?
Okay, so I asked myself this question the other day, so I went to Google. And I wanted to know who were the patrons of the BDS. So I Googled BDS patrons, and what I got was a link to the PSC. That's how close they are. And it provided me with the PSC patrons. And amongst those patrons sits the leader of the opposition, Jeremy Corbyn. And those of us who have been at protests over the years know Jeremy Corbyn very well. He stands on the podium together with the PSC, together with the BDS, and he speaks against Israel, and he speaks in favor of Hamas. As much as he says that they're not his friends when he uses those words, there's video footage of him acknowledging that they are his friends. He speaks about, he hosted Hezbollah in the House of Parliament, and he made a statement that he was pleased to host them. He then went on to say that they had invited Hamas, but Hamas cannot attend because the Israeli government had not given them exit visas. This is the closeness of the leader of the opposition to the BDS, to the PSC, and this is a huge problem for us. As Ambrosine said, there's an election coming up, and people need to be aware of this is a kind of racism that's coming up. BDS and PSC are intrinsically intertwined. They are there to delegitimize the state of Israel, and they're there to delegitimize and dehumanize the Jews. And they need to be taken seriously by government. The idea that our House of Parliament should host events where these people are allowed to speak really needs to be stopped. It needs to come to an end.
Let's have a look now at a presentation produced by the former Chief Rabbi, Lord Jonathan Sacks, on the BDS and how it steps over into what is known as Jew hatred.
The boycott, divestment and sanctions campaign against Israel is dangerously wrong, because beneath the surface, it's an attempt to delegitimize Israel as a prelude to its elimination. No Jew and no humanitarian can stand by and see that happen. Besides which, it will harm the very people it seeks to help, prolong the situation it seeks to end, and lead to wrongs in the name of rights. I support the right of Palestinians to a state of their own, and the right of Palestinian children to a future of dignity and hope. But the BDS campaign will achieve neither of these things. Let me explain why. Human rights are the rights we have because we are human. They are universal or they are nothing. So the test of any movement in support of human rights is it really universal? Or is it a matter of rights for some, but not for others? If the BDS movement were really about human rights, its supporters would be protesting the breakdown of human rights in countries across the Middle East, in Africa and around the world. They would be demonstrating against the barbarism of ISIS. They would be campaigning against the abuse of human rights by Hamas in Gaza. Any nation can be held to account at the bar of human rights, but in a world awash with human rights abuses, to focus on one nation only, and that the only effective democracy in the Middle East, looks less like a campaign for human rights than a campaign against Israel's very right to be. It is, in fact, the latest chapter in a sustained attempt to do just that. In 1948, 1967, and 1973, Israel's enemies tried to destroy it militarily, by war, and they failed. Beginning in 1973 with the Arab boycott, they tried to destroy it economically, and they failed. In 1975, with the notorious Zionism is racism motion in the United Nations, they tried to destroy it politically, and they failed. From 1994 to 2002, by a campaign of suicide bombings, they tried to destroy it psychologically, and they failed. Now, through the BDS campaign, they're trying to delegitimize it morally. This too will fail, but it's serious. It's based on a vicious lie that Israel is a colonial presence in the Middle East. It's nothing of the kind. The Jewish connection with the land of Israel goes back roughly twice as long as the history of Christianity, 3 times as long as the history of Islam. Jews are the only nation in history ever to have established a nation-state in the land, and the only nation never to have lacked a presence there. And because Israel is the world's only Jewish state, and the only state whose very right to exist has been constantly challenged, the campaign against it is recognizably the latest mutation of the world's oldest hate, anti-Semitism. BDS will fail because when people seek to end a conflict by focusing on only one party to that conflict, they don't end it, they perpetuate it. There could have been a Palestinian state in 1947 with the United Nations vote for partition. In 1948, when the modern state of Israel was born. In 1967, after the Six-Day War. In 2000, at Camp David. 2001, at Taba. In 2007, under Ehud Olmert. And since. In each case, Israel said yes, offering land in exchange for peace. But the Palestinian leadership said no. And even when Israel unilaterally withdrew from territories such as South Lebanon in 2000 and the Gaza Strip in 2005, the space was immediately filled by terrorist organizations, Hezbollah and Hamas, dedicated to Israel's destruction. Simply put, the BDS campaign will delay, defer, and endanger the very chance of a Palestinian state, prolonging the suffering it seeks to end. This is because it misrepresents the conflict as a zero-sum game. Either Israel wins and the Palestinians lose, or the Palestinians win and Israel loses. But the conflict is not a zero-sum game. From war and violence, both sides lose. From peace and security, both sides win. If we really care about the rights of Palestinians, then we must care about those of Israelis likewise. Rights are universal, or they are nothing. And if they're merely a concealed form of hate, then they become not rights, but wrongs. Any movement for human rights or peace or justice must be fair to all sides, recognize the rights of all sides, seek the agreement of all sides, and win the trust of all sides. The BDS campaign, which seeks to intimidate and silence the other side, fails these tests, which is why all who care for our shared humanity must find another and better way.
A superb presentation there by Rabbi Jonathan Sachs in explaining what the BDS is and the implications of the BDS's policies. Now, Ambrosine, in terms of the BDS movement and the new working definition of anti-Semitism, is the BDS movement being monitored by this working group on anti-Semitism, and could prosecutions follow?
Okay, there is not. This is quite interesting because I was doing some research on the BDS here, and there is not one website that's dedicated to the BDS. As we've said, it's the PSC. Is there a monitoring organisation that's looking at all of this and then giving it to the police or giving it to members of parliament? No. We have a Jewish community with all different types of organisations that are fighting the BDS, exposing it. Our organisation, Iron Anti-Semitism, is doing something, Campaign for Truth, and we work at it in a different way, but there is not one Ofcom, there's not one organisation that's literally settled there, because BDS isn't one organisation. It is a amalgamation of different organisations, far left NGOs, far right NGOs as well, who are, their main concern is to annihilate or get rid of Israel, and in that way get rid of the Jewish people. So unfortunately, no, there's not one lobby organisation that's doing that.
And we're down to 6 minutes of the programme, Sharon. Now, you're very concerned about a big conference being organised in central London, very close to Westminster, in which the Palestinian Solidarity Campaign are organising a 2-day conference. They're calling it the Palestinian Expo. What are your concerns regarding this conference?
Okay. This is a conference that's taking place over 2 days at the Queen Elizabeth Conference Centre, which is a government-owned conference centre. It's taking place over 5 floors of the Queen Elizabeth Centre. So if anybody who's been there will know that this is going to attract thousands of people into the area to come to the centre, where they're going to hear speakers who range from Liane Mohammed, who was the schoolgirl who won that debating competition, giving a diatribe of anti-Jew invective, or anti-Israel invective, talking about Palestine. She lost the prize in the end because she was too political, and everybody had sympathy for her because she was a schoolgirl. But here she appears at a PSC event as a speaker, talking to students. Amongst the other speakers are a range of people, from activists to just anti-Semitic journalists. I won't go through the list of names. Our objection to this is based on 2 issues. One is security. We've had recent incidents in Westminster where we've had stabbings, we've had car rammings, we've had a man arrested with knives, we've had a group of people arrested in northwest London who are ostensibly terrorist linked. We do know that the man with knives has been on a convoy to Gaza in parallel with the PSC. We don't know that he was entirely with them, but he was in parallel with the PSC, who were arranging these convoys. So our concern is security. Who are they going to attract? Where are they going to come from? They bill it as the biggest exposition in Europe. So they're going to attract people like the Indonesian chap who posted a link into their Facebook page of Hitlerism, of Jew hatred, of kill the Jews. These are the kind of people we fear they're going to attract, and we fear that a Manchester could happen in London. It's close to Whitehall, it's a mile from Whitehall. The second thing is the anti-Semitism that's going to be instigated at this event by the speakers. We know the speakers. They have appeared all over this country on campuses. This is what we protest against. So this rise in anti-Semitism is going to occur at this meeting. This replacement ideology is going to be spread, the propaganda is going to be spread, with a lack of any source reference to the information that they give to the unsuspecting audience.
And Amber Singh, we do live in a democracy, thankfully, and this is the right to protest and to demonstrate, both sides, and that they have the freedom to advocate for the Palestinian cause, in which they do. But when does this stop? When does this step over into anti-Semitism? And are you concerned that this conference could pose problems for Israel and the Jewish people?
What I'm very angry at is that you wouldn't allow far-right groups, I won't mention them, to hold, or the QE2 Centre wouldn't allow them to hold a conference, a 2-day conference on 2 floors 5 floors, in fact, with speakers from these particular right-wing groups. They wouldn't allow it. And there have been reports out, there have been a number of mainstream press articles connecting the PSC to anti-Semitic activity through speakers, through supporters, etc. And again with Al-Aqsa. Al-Aqsa is another one of the organisations, Friends of Al-Aqsa, who are part and parcel of this particular conference. So freedom of speech, yes, absolutely. Everyone has the right to speak. But unfortunately, this particular conference centre would not allow others and other voices to hold an event at this particular conference centre. And they certainly wouldn't allow it if they were racist against any other minority of people or any other sexuality. They would basically ban that particular conference, and that's why we're so upset about it, because of its connections to anti-Semitism.
Within 2 minutes, the programme's ending. Sharon, so how can our viewers can get involved, and how do you want to create awareness regarding this conference that's taking place?
I would just like to say, apropos what Ambrosine was talking about, that I think it was a couple of years ago that I think it was a Christian organisation, I think Christian Aid, were going to hold a conference at Queen Elizabeth, and it was cancelled because it was about gay marriage. They wouldn't agree that they could accept gay marriage. So Queen Elizabeth Conference, they actually cancelled the event. So there is a precedent that they can cancel an event that is contentious, that promotes race hate, that promotes a division in society. How can you get involved? You can go, there's a Facebook page called Action Against PSC Friends of Al-Aqsa Conference Expo. You can go there, you can link onto that. You can join the actions that are going to be taken, and that will be put on the Facebook page. You can lobby your MP. I know that we're in the middle of election cycle at the moment, but contact your MP, ask him to help. Queen Elizabeth Centre belongs to the government. The government has a duty to protect all its citizens, and particularly with the Arab-Israel conflict, the government should not be seen to participating with one side against the other side. So get involved, lobby your MP, write to your newspapers, do something.
Ladies, Ambrosine and Sharon, just thank you so much for being my guest on today's Middle East. You've done a great job. Thank you.
Thank you, Simon.
And I just want to thank you for watching today's Middle East report, where we've really made clear the dangers posed by the PDS and how that we have to stand and fight for the right definition of Zionism, which is the right for the Jewish people to return to their ancient homeland. And I'm just going to leave you with this beautiful song that celebrates the beauty that is Jerusalem.
ניסע ברוח 40 עם כל פעמונים ופתרת מטילן ואבן שבויה בחלומה העיר אשר בדד יושבת ובליבה חזרנו אל עוד המים לשיר לך ולך לקשור כתרים. קטונתי מצעיר בנייך או מאחרון המשוררים, כי שמך צורף את השפתיים כנשיקת שרף. אם אשכחך ירושלים